All right, it is Monday the 13th. I'm headed to work here. I got a topic that I'm pulling from Reddit. It's an interesting one. I've talked about this kind of thing before, but I figured it's top of Reddit, might as well talk about it. So, how are we all preparing for interviews these days? This person says, and this is for people that have been in the industry for a little while. So, I've been at my current job for almost a decade. I haven't done any serious interviewing since before the pandemic. Starting to get ants in my current position, want to dedicate some time to studying so that I can feel ready to interview in a few months. So I think that's wise. I think personally, like, I don't do a good job of this, but I think it's good for people to basically be ready to interview. I don't want to say at any point because that might be like a little extreme, but to be able to be comfortable interviewing within like a few weeks to a month or something, I would say is probably a good spot to be in. For me, like, I haven't interviewed since before Microsoft, right? So I would need to go dedicate a lot of time to it. So what resources and studying strategies are people using these days, particularly if you already have solid years of experience under your belt? And then they talk about cracking the coding interview, considered the Bible, seems outdated now. I know LeetCode is still a popular answer. There's similar sites or resources that people are using. So I'm going to talk about this from my experience. Let's get on the road here. I had a bit of a rough start. I'm trying to get to bed a little bit earlier. I'm saying my bag is too heavy on the passenger seat. It's definitely not the heaviest it's been. So stop beeping at me, car. Trying to get to bed earlier because I have to wake up at 5 for CrossFit. Why is it saying that? It's really confused thinking that there's weight on the seat. There's nothing on the seat anymore. But anyway, if I have any sort of sleep disruption with my current sleep schedule, it means like I drop below 6 hours of sleep. And then I cannot get up to go to CrossFit to function. And I don't have any other physical activity aside from going to the gym. So I'm trying to change that to get an extra hour of sleep. So in bed by 10 instead of by 11. This front passenger airbag is disabled. Okay, well, good thing no one's there, but there's literally nothing in the seat. So what are you talking about? But yeah, like, I think at 10 o'clock, I was trying to help a user onboard to Brand Ghost. They're saying they're getting errors. And when I looked into it, it was like the LinkedIn API was telling me like they're throttling us, like too many requests. So I'm like, well, what the hell? I check on the portal. We're nowhere near close to any API limits on any single API that they have. So that's super confusing. And then I had another user overnight that was like, hey, I'm trying to refresh my LinkedIn account. Doesn't work. They're being throttled. So I had to go open a support ticket and be like, hey, why are you throttling us if none of the things show that we're near any API limits? So it's kind of ridiculous. Like, the APIs that we have for posting stuff are still going totally fine, but that they're throttling us on authentication requests. So very bizarre. So anyway, gotta sort through that, but it kind of chewed up that extra hour of time that I was trying to get. So back to bed by 11, and then I had someone this morning that was being kind of ridiculous on LinkedIn. They were saying, and this maybe is a good rant. If you're interested in a rant on this, let me know in the comments and I'll consider it. I'm probably going to get pretty heated. But they were like, I talk about software engineering management, like similar kinds of stuff on LinkedIn and social media. And this person commented and said, most people don't need to be managed. And like, I mean, I think they're looking for they're looking for problems, sort of commenting on the post to say that, because it's like completely at odds with the things that I'm talking about. So I gave them a bunch of examples of and like there's, I mean, a million examples, but gave them a bunch of different things where it's like, these are things that I help people with, like that's part of my role. And their response was essentially something like, none of that is helpful, and like can tell by the response, like from oozing from your managerial pustules, is what they said. Then they ended up deleting their comment, so I asked them, Like, why did you decide to delete that, right? Like, you're such a tough guy on the internet. By the way, the interesting thing is this person does contract work, so perhaps they've never actually been integrated on a team or had to work in a business sort of trying to advance their career. So I could understand maybe if they're like, hey, that type of work has never been in alignment with me. Okay, so yeah, there's your opinion. But I don't think statistically that's an accurate statement to say that most people don't need to be managed. In fact, I think one of the interesting things we hear is that people will leave bad bosses or leave people that don't manage them. So I don't know. Maybe I don't know anything and I've been kind of just wasting my time for 12 plus years, but interesting take. So back to today's topic. If you have other questions that you want answered, please leave them in the comments. I'm happy to do that. Or send me a message on social media. Just look for Dev Leader or Nick Cosentino on LinkedIn. Happy to do that. I've been trying to, when I can, if I find something good on Reddit, I've been trying to like drop a note to the author to say I'll make a video. Reddit's a helpful spot for promoting things, but I'm not allowed to self-promote. So if you're watching my videos and you think they're helpful, maybe you want to share them on Reddit. Helps me, but I don't want to risk getting banned on any subreddits for self-promotion, so I shan't do that. Okay, so prepping for interviews. I think we have 3 different categories of things with respect to interviews, regardless of your level, and I would argue even regardless of your role. And that's from my experience, and I think the thing that differs the most is the level of involvement or the level of scrutiny, maybe we can call it, that go into each of these categories. I thought that person was going to turn. There's 2 left turn lanes, and they were in the lane to my right, and I'm already in the second left turn lane, so no space for you. So the 3 areas are going to be your coding questions, your sort of like system design questions, big yawn, and then your behavioral interview questions. And all of them are important. And even like as an engineering manager, I've talked about this before when I was applying for big tech positions, so Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Amazon, they all have coding rounds, even for managers. I think except, I might have this wrong, I think Amazon didn't. One of them didn't, and I don't know if I just happened to get lucky and none of the interviewers asked me that. But I'm pretty sure Amazon didn't. I have to get in a different lane here. This is very bad. These people are going under the speed limit. We don't do that here. Like, I'm still just about to get to the speed limit. Kind of crazy. So all 3 categories are important. And I would say, like, my perspective on this stuff is the more senior you become, the less, and not only that, like, if you're an engineering manager kind of working towards that direction, your time in code is less important because most management roles don't involve that. I'm assuming this person's individual contributor, so their coding skills are going to be important. But I would say even as you're becoming more and more senior, I'm personally less interested in trying to sort of scrutinize or gauge someone's coding ability in an interview the more senior they are. And that's because a similar thing starts to happen. Like, I'm going to need some proof that people can code, right? I'm going to need some proof of that. But in my opinion, if I had an hour with someone, I don't want to spend the whole time just trying to make sure that they can write code, because there are more like valuable things that I would rather be trying to gauge. Again, if you're brand new, like, early in career or junior or mid-level even, I need to get a little bit more proof of that, because a lot of what you're doing is going to be that. But as you're more and more senior, there's going to be a lot more like expectations around system architecture. You're going to be in a position where you're leading projects, right? You're like the point person on them. So you may genuinely find yourself writing less code because you're doing a lot more coordination and leading certain things. The type of impact you're having at higher levels requires that I can see that you're doing some of these other things more effectively. So like that's where I need to see better system design. I need to see better on the behavioral interviews. So you'll hear me talk about this a lot, but when I talk about most things, I try to not do them like binary on-off, black or white. I like to talk about them on spectrums. So if we had all three of these categories and we look at them on spectrums, I would say if we take someone who's like early in career, right, on a spectrum, I would want to gauge their coding ability much more. So that would be higher on that spectrum. Their system design, probably less. Not because it's not valuable, but because one, they probably have less experience doing it, and two, I don't know if I said doing it, and two, the expectations that they're doing that in their role at that point are probably lower. So I don't need to grill them as much on that. I don't need to see as much. So that'll be lower on the spectrum. And then behavioral interviews for me are always, that's always a big component. I personally have a very strong belief that software engineering has a lot more to do with the interactions between people than maybe some people will admit to or acknowledge. And that's just because working with software engineering teams, I have seen people that probably score very well on the coding part or probably score very well on the system design part, and they're a challenge to work with. And then as a result, we're not getting the benefit of their skills in those other areas. So to me, the behavioral part is always important. And then I would say the more senior that you are, honestly, the more and more important it becomes. If you're a senior developer, what I would say is that the expectations around coding, like it's almost like they need to be there, but I don't want to spend the time in the interview trying to gauge that, right? I will still do it, but it's like I want to spend more time on system design and behavioral interview stuff. So anyway, that's this perspective from like how I gauge going through the interview process. But those three things, and the reason I wanted to do that story is to kind of like paint a picture for you that if you were to go, prep for interviews, like those are sort of the priority areas in your time allotment that I would recommend that you look at personally. But the other thing to factor in here is that you might personally be better at some of these than others with respect to interviews. So for example, I think most people in most companies, unfortunately, when they have coding questions, they're usually like a LeetCode style question. I don't like these types of questions. I think that I look at them kind of like when I went to university and we had exams, it's almost like the questions would be kind of like a trick. And then the argument was like, well, if you really understand the domain or the problem space, like you should be able to like pick up on the trick. And I'm like, well, I feel like that's kind of a bullshit thing to say, because it means that if I don't happen to get the trick, then you're saying I don't know anything, because I literally will not be able to score any points on the exam. And I find that like with LeetCode style questions, the way that people gauge these in interviews can be the same. And I've seen this firsthand, because a lot of places will have their developers doing the interviews to kind of crowdsource them, right? And I've been in these interview sort of like syncs, and people will say like, no, that person did bad. And you might have like two people from the panel that are like, oh, they seem to do pretty well in mine. Like, what did you observe? And it's kind of like, well, I gave them this question, and there's a trick to it. They didn't get the trick. And then we're kind of sitting there like, so what? Like, they couldn't find a trick in your question, and so they're not going to be able to move forward. Because what are we testing here, right? Like, we're testing people that can find tricks? Like, that seems like bullshit to me. So unfortunately, a lot of places do ask questions like this, though. So I do highly recommend that you practice LeetCode style questions. If you see my other content, I am not a fan of LeetCode at all. I will add in, just because I know some people love it. If you find that it's a great way for you to practice and it keeps your brain sharp and you have fun doing it, like, by all means. I'm not saying like you're not allowed to. I'm just saying that I think it's not a good representation of building software. And that's what we do. So like, I just don't like it for that reason. But if you want to supplement with it, great. And I think too, like for interviews, it's a must. I have said this before, but when I was interviewing in big tech, I hadn't, like this person who wrote on Reddit, I hadn't interviewed in 8 years. And I was going for a manager position, and I still said, I have to go grind LeetCode questions. You might be, so going back to what I was saying, you might be someone that is already strong in LeetCode questions because you enjoy doing them, and that's like sometimes you'll spend some time doing it. Great. That's awesome. You're one step ahead, in my opinion, from the interview perspective. Because a lot of us just don't do that kind of stuff at work, and we don't enjoy doing LeetCode questions. But then we have them on interviews, and it's something that we have to get better at doing. So that's one thing, the LeetCode questions. The system design ones are kind of interesting. This person was asking about resources. I'm sure there are lots of really good resources out there. I'm not sure of any off the top of my head, unfortunately. So what I was doing when I was studying for mine was I essentially went to go look at, you'll see like high level things like how Uber has like their system, and how Netflix does their feed, and how Twitter works with their feed and tweets, and how Instagram is able to, have like their system work. So you can find examples of this stuff online, and I think the point that I found helpful was not to like try and memorize like what does Netflix do? Like, how does their system work exactly? Because like in system design, at least, I feel like that's not the point. I've definitely seen people that have like memorized like LeetCode style questions, and they can basically blast them out like it's muscle memory. But with system design, and number one, for the LeetCode, that's why I don't like LeetCode as well. It's just like, it's easy to kind of gamify if you're like just very good at doing those and you've seen lots of questions. But with system design, I don't think it's about memorization as much, or you can't use that as like a hack. And so like memorizing what Uber does or what Netflix does, I don't think is as helpful. But I think understanding those systems and why they made decisions is helpful, right? You'll see things like, I think like the concept behind queues is really important, and like eventual consistency is really important, because a lot of the time we're talking about these really big distributed systems, right? You need to talk about the different aspects that need to be prioritized in those systems, and you need to think like, so that could be latency, that could be like I was saying, the eventual consistency kind of challenge, that could be resiliency. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff, throughput. So I think understanding what types of building blocks we have and how they can sort of affect those different things can be really helpful. And when we talk things like resiliency and stuff like that, I mean, there's many building blocks that you can put into place for that kind of thing. It's just like understanding the pieces that you have to work with, I think goes a really long way. So if someone was like, sometimes you'll hear examples of like, design a payment system, or they'll give you a system that should have some type of payments included. And if you're trying to design this system and not thinking about the fact that like at different points things could fail, and someone's sort of transactions in play, like, are you going to bill them twice? Is the billing not going to go through and they're going to get the thing? They're trying to get a resource like a movie seat or a ticket, and now like 10 people bought it at the same time. So like you have to think about when you're putting these components together, how can you address these types of things? So, I mean, sometimes if you're thinking about them in a single process, you can kind of rationalize them, but the extension of that is thinking about a bigger system with many processes potentially across different, like across a big geography potentially, and you can talk about parts of the system going down too. So what I found was really helpful personally was trying to take those examples, like the Netflix systems or Twitter or Uber, and then basically what I would do is think about what they optimized for and then try to like kind of change some constraints, if that makes sense. And this is actually how I ask these system design questions, is like coming up with something basic, like we're gonna go design a system for buying movie tickets, and then we'll talk through it. And then when people design things, I'll say, great, okay, now that we've talked about why you made these choices, let's change the constraints. It's not a trick question. It's like, let's just, enhance the question with something else. Like, this is how you would design it for this reason. What if I said now that this other thing was important? What part of your design would you want to change, right? And then getting to see people, how they would modify different components of the system. So, gotta pass this bus, man. It's too much. So I like that kind of style. And I think something that's like really valuable when you're doing system design questions is like, it's pretty common that, and it happens in the coding ones too, but especially for system design, a lot of the time the questions will be left pretty open-ended. So someone will say, and this isn't always the case, but just as an example, like, let's design a system for buying movie tickets. And you'll say, okay, cool. And your gears might start turning in your head because you were practicing some stuff at home already. And you're like, okay, I know I'm gonna have like probably something like a saga in there and I might need like a queuing system, and like you're kind of designing. But the trick with a lot of these is like, if you just start putting stuff down on paper in terms of the system components, you haven't actually asked them or clarified like what things are important. Now, you might have some ideas, but I think it's extremely important to practice clarifying these things. So like, is latency really important? Are we talking about having these types of events where like a movie goes, comes to theaters and like, everyone wants to go see it, and now we have to have, we need to sort of plan for our system to have like a ridiculous traffic surge, right? Because how you design your system at steady state versus that might be completely different. You might need to think about other mechanisms you need to balance that stuff out. So it's very, very important to be doing that. Oh man, this truck is in the way. Okay, we're going. Whew. Okay. There was a really big truck that was basically blocking all the spots for me to merge in. But when I looked ahead, I could see that more people moved over, so we had a little slice to merge. So anyway, I think that's how I would recommend practicing those system design ones, but there's lots of resources so you can go understand, like, what components do we use for, like, what types of databases work in certain ways when we're talking about like ACID, when we're talking about eventual consistency, when we're talking about being able to replicate data. What kind of patterns do we have, like circuit breaker patterns, like things like that for when downstream systems are not available, right? Like, does the whole system fail? There's so many things to consider. So I think it takes, if you're not used to this kind of stuff, understand the building blocks, and then make sure in the interview you're asking the interviewer about the constraints they want optimized for. We had to get in front of that Tesla. There's no way that Tesla's getting in front of us. Okay, and then the last group is behavioral interviews. And I realized I didn't realize I was going to spend so much time on the other ones, but behavioral interviews are extremely important. I have a course on behavioral interviews on Dome Train. I don't plug my courses and stuff up as much on this channel, but I figured I should mention them. Like, if you're interested, you can go to dometrain.com. That's a site run by Nick Chapsis, who is a very popular C# and .NET content creator. Most courses on there are C# and .NET related, but I have a bunch that are career focused with another co-creator, Ryan Murphy. But we have one on behavioral interviews. It's like 6 hours long. We're both engineering managers at larger tech companies with over a decade of experience each. So I would recommend that if you're not sure where to start. But one of the biggest things that I can recommend for behavioral interviews is understanding that there's a point to the question that's being asked. And when you're in behavioral interviews, it's almost never about the technology, which is, I think, really challenging for many software engineers, because you'll hear questions that are like, tell me about a project you worked on when, some circumstance happened. So what do we want to do? Okay, Mr. or Mrs. Interviewer, I worked on this really cool project. Here's what it did. Here's the system. Here's the technology choices we made. Here's why we did that. Here's some of the nuanced details about how this thing works and why it's so cool. But I hate to break it to you, they just don't care. It's like, there's a certain level of detail that's helpful for framing it, but beyond that, unfortunately, you're sort of wasting time. You could be focused on kind of getting to the point of what their question is. So I think that my biggest piece of advice is making sure that you, ahead of time, when you're practicing behavioral interview questions, understanding what those questions are after. Okay, so I made a video this morning when I was talking about some of these already. So if you watch the previous one that I posted, some of this will seem like repeat, but if someone's giving you questions about, tell me about a time you worked in a team, and then they're tacking on to that, and then the project was falling behind schedule, or there was a conflict with a peer, or there was a conflict with the person leading it, or pardon me, or tell me what worked really well on that. They're not after the details of the project itself. They don't need to know that you picked Postgres for that, or that you that it needed to be done in Rust. You might love those things and they're fun to talk about, but when they're framing it like you're working in a team, okay, so that means you had to be working with other people. They're trying to get you to talk about the interactions with other people. Then they give you the scenario that's there was a conflict. Okay, so how did you resolve the conflict with a peer? Right? Did you just avoid it? Did you just pretend it didn't happen? Did you go confront them and you were mean to them? Did you just say screw it, I'm talking to my manager? Or did you maybe behind closed doors send them a message or have a conversation and say, hey, by the way, I noticed that we were not aligning on this. I just wanted to talk through it and see if we can get on the same page so I can understand your perspective. Maybe we can agree to disagree, but we should at least clear the air on this. Maybe that's a good strategy. Maybe you tried that, didn't work, and they were actually really mean despite you trying to do this. You got feedback from your manager, tried it again, blah, blah, blah. But that's what they're after. They want to see how that you're navigating those things. And it almost had nothing to do with the project or the technology. It's a behavioral interview question, right? So I'm saying this and totally acknowledging I am a software engineer at heart, right? I love building systems, writing software. I write code all of the time outside of work. I tried to write code for 15 minutes this morning before I got in the car. I love writing code and I love building things, but it's not always the time and place to be talking about those details. So the other piece of advice that I gave in the video this morning around behavioral interviews is this idea that I think it's really important you practice your stories and understand them. And I don't mean, I said this again in the video this morning, I don't mean like you become a good storyteller by making things up or embellishing. I mean that you have an understanding of the stories and sort of the key parts from your experiences, right? So that what you're able to do very effectively is you have a bunch of these sort of experiences that you can draw upon, and someone then says, tell me about a time when whatever, and ideally you have a couple of different scenarios from your experience where you can say, I can go talk about X, or I can go talk about Y. And I say a couple because if you're like me, I get stressed out and I blank out. So I don't do well on things like written exams because they're very uncomfortable for me. So I will blank out. And interviews, like I get nervous during interviews. I've been on, the giving end of interviews for over 12 years, but I have certainly given more interviews than I have done for myself. I understand how they work, but it doesn't mean I don't get nervous. So my preparation is making sure that I have a high level of comfort in the stories that I want to be able to navigate. So what might work well for you is thinking through some eventful things, like in terms of deliverables, projects, collaborations, things that have gone well, things that didn't, and maybe even just like point form, like making like a note, like a list of like what happened in each of those things. And then what you might be able to do is do like a bit of a mind map and say like, okay, well, this was a story that had like collaboration aspects. This was a story that had, friction, or this was an example of me like demonstrating leadership, or, whatever it happens to be, but kind of like annotating or tagging the stories that you have with, some of these things that people will be interviewing you for. And that way you can recall them a little bit easier. So that's my advice. I think all three things are super important. I think depending on your experience level, I would kind of shift the focus, but also depending on what you're comfortable with, you may want to shift the focus as well, because like I said, if you're awesome at doing LeetCode and maybe not awesome at behavioral interviews, maybe shift your focus to get good at the thing that might hold you back. So I hope that helps. Best of luck with your interviewing. I know, like I said, I know it's challenging. It's not something that I feel comfortable doing, but interviewing is a skill, right? The more that you do it, the better you'll get. So if it's hard and you're like beating yourself up over it, like, oh man, I bombed that interview, I did so terrible, that's okay. The next one you'll do better, and that one still might not be good, but it'll be better, and you'll keep getting better. You'll keep getting more comfortable, okay? It's just like any other skill. Hope that helps. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.